All right. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 269th, being recorded on Thursday, August 27th, 2020 at noon Eastern Time, we've got Dan Wilson, who's going to talk about how to use the ColdFusion API Manager to modernize your app. And that's awesome, Dan. I look forward to it. Thanks very much. And go ahead and share your screen and take it away. He needs a moment to set something up there.
All right, with any luck, you're seeing a slide deck.
We do.
And I'm going to try moving the chat somewhere where I can see it. There it is.
And the pictures. Yep.
Okay. Right. Welcome, everyone. So today, this presentation is in two parts. And before I begin, I'd like to mention that Charlie Earhart's been a tireless supporter of our community for decades at this point. Unfortunately, not everybody knows what a great troubleshooter he is. And so if you find yourself with servers on fire and don't know what to do, you can ask Charlie to parachute right in the middle of all this, and he'll be able to help you find a resolution in just a handful of hours. So keep him in mind when it all goes wrong. In this presentation, we're going to talk about when it all goes right. Speaking of which, one of the things that we did recently was we sent out a survey to see what you find folks wanted to hear about, and APIs, REST, and how to build them really came in top with 70+%. The next closest thing was application architecture. So this talk is going to be a combination of both of those. The first half is going to be how you can get from your current monolithic state into an API architecture. And the second half is why the API manager from ColdFusion deserves a look, because it really does. One of the things I learned in this topic gathering process was just how powerful this thing is. And it shocks me that everyone isn't using it already. So currently I work with Digital Primates. You may remember them from Flex and Air and things like that. We do Enterprise React development and Enterprise JavaScript. We also curate the Enterprise React newsletter. And so if that's your kind of thing, you can Google it and sign up. Our developers basically submit all the articles. So it's by developers for developers. We don't spam. So it's important to kind of see where we are in the arc of technology. The right half of this slide is still being written, but the left half is pretty legit. When I started in technology, it was all client server based. You had to install things, but the clients were rich and had lots of functionality. When the web came along, you kind of got out of this install stuff, but as you know, the technology at that point was in its infancy. What you could do from a user interface perspective was very, very limited. I remember in the year 2000 writing some JavaScript that followed my cursor around and said words, and boy, I thought I was cool. Less cool when I realized I had to write it for 3 different browsers so it would work, but still, hey, that's interactivity, isn't it? About the middle of the 2000s, Flex came around and offered a way on the client side to do more without having to have installable apps. And Silverlight came around, and basically the market wanted interactivity. The problem is those were both closed proprietary runtimes and they blew up. So where we're at now is customers still expect rich functionality, and we're delivering it via JavaScript in the browser, which is basically free runtimes and open runtimes. And so the stage is kind of set for everyone to have the runtime that you need them to have while delivering the applications that users want. And keep in mind, these users, while they may work with you in a business context, they're used to using Apple apps and Amazon, where everything is fast and rich and loads immediately, and they're judging you. And if you don't provide a good enough experience, they'll either not do business with you, or in the case of internal folks, find more expensive ways to get their jobs done, like do work through email or don't follow a process. So, don't think you're out of the woods on this one. So let's talk about legacy. The definition is, it works. So lots of people have legacy apps. Depending on when your legacy app was built, it may follow one or more architectural principles, but generally speaking, you'll notice they all have very, very similar issues. The testing can be very, very difficult. There's a lot of munging of concerns. There's been probably many developers working on this over many years. So there's parts of the app that people don't even know what it does, or maybe it's in different architecture. And this app is hard to scale, and there's just a ton of technical debt. So really, the reason why these apps still exist is because they're useful. They're just a pain to work with. And this causes fear of touching this app, being afraid it might break. I even know some folks who have a job, and the reason why they have that job is because they're the only ones who know how this certain critical application is put together, and they're employed for life until somehow this application goes away. So, I agree that legacy apps can be complex and have a lot of issues, but the job of an application is to solve business problems. And as we'll see in this presentation, it can be hard to get from a monolithic style application into APIs, but fear not, I've got some strategies for you. So I always find the best way to learn about complex computer topics is to talk about anything that's not computing. So why don't we go with spaghetti? You can see here that on the left, I've got the components of an application. And if you think about this in a spaghetti style context and put everything in the pot, stir it around, you end up with spaghetti. The great thing about spaghetti is it works. It's tasty and solves your hunger. The downside of spaghetti is you can't go backwards. Like, it's not possible to take spaghetti and disassemble it and get it back in the box, so to speak. So if you have a monolithic app, you're kind of presented with an issue here of what do you do with this spaghetti. One other issue you might notice is that these applications have a hard time scaling. And one reason why that is because usually scalability is a problem in just a small part of the app, but because your application's all munged together, you'd have to scale the entire application. So in the world of scaling, we have something called horizontal scalability, which looks a lot like this. And the strategy can be summed up as just add more servers and it will be fine. In some cases, this is true, and in other cases, it's not. So if we peer into the innards of these spaghetti applications, you can see you're going to find some common actors here. You've got your application servers, and obviously your application logic goes in there. You got your databases, and you got your storage systems. And basically, like in the spaghetti example, these all combine into one application. Now, what happens when you add more servers? There's a few things that don't scale well. Database writes. This is a hard problem. Some of the more modern NoSQL stuff is supposed to be better at this, but generally speaking, propagating writes across a bunch of servers is still a hard problem. Individual file systems don't scale well. I'm reminded of this application I wrote that generated barcodes, and I tested it and everything was great, and we rolled it out, and 2/3 of the users were complaining the barcodes wouldn't load, and it dawned on me that saving these barcodes to the individual file system when we had 3 servers is probably not a good idea, and I needed to find a client-side way to do this. Fortunately, there's a JavaScript barcode generator that I used, and because the client renders these things, I got out of the problem. But if you have a situation where you're storing documents on a server and you try to add another server, you got to ask yourself, where are these documents going to go? Server-side sessions, this is like a big no-no. These don't scale either. Yeah, somewhere in the ColdFusion administrator, they'll tell you that you can replicate sessions. That feature should, it mostly works. I think the fair way to say it, like, this is also a hard problem because of replication. So you got to ask yourself, how do you deal with this? Because these things are going to cause you scalability problems. So, I put together a rather complicated technical image of what these types of applications look like inside of a corporate environment. And I think this is probably the best way to put it is you've got all this stuff going all over the place. It's got horns and it's poking everybody, and it's really just chaos. So, if you find yourself in a spot like this, or part of your org looks like this, kind of figuratively speaking, this next section is really designed for you. So going back to spaghetti, maybe you can separate some of this. And so if we agree that the noodles are a presentation layer and UI, it's possible to stick all this stuff in the calendar and rinse it out. And hey, you've at least got your noodles back. The business logic and data might still be all munged together in a saucy-like way, but as you'll see in the next few slides, maybe that's all right. So step one, if you're trying to disassemble a monolith or spaghetti, is to break it up into what I call bound contexts. And I call it that because that's what it said on a website that I liked. But what you want to kind of do here is, thinking of this fictional e-commerce example, is break out the context, which, you know, sort of encapsulate a thing or a concept inside of your application. And you can see on the left here, I've broken out some common ones you'd find in an e-commerce situation. Now, keep in mind, like, some of these things touch other contexts, like customers have payments, products are in inventory, but they're sort of separate things. And once you have an idea of the context in your application, you can start to break some of this out, because much like that herd of wildebeests, if you can fence off the dangerous things, they become tame. Fortunately, our ancestors figured this out, so we can all have a good ribeye every once in a while. But I want you to think of these images, because sometimes these topics are dense, and you may start thinking of how this applies to your own use case. But if you go back to the mental model here of the spaghetti, of trying to untangle it, of wildebeest and fencing them off, the strategy sort of like lays itself out for you. So I'd caution you not to think too detailed at this point. So this is like the big reveal here of what you should do to get your application in a good state. Feel free to write this email down and then go ahead and send it off to your boss. It's going to work just like you think it's going to. Because all developers that I know, their first response is, well, we just need to rewrite it. It's like, yep, that's going to work. So you send this to your boss, and they're going to be naturally pleased and ask you, you know, how many millions of dollars would you like? Because obviously it's in our best interest to pay all this money to rebuild the same functionality we have and stand still, not moving the ball forward whatsoever. So this isn't going to work. Early in my career, I never understood why, but later in my career, it's not a thing. So basically, not only is the boss not going to buy off on it, but if you imagine what you're really going to do to untangle this monolithic application, there's a very high chance of failure here, because nobody really knows how this thing is really put together. You're going to miss something. So let's work with this thing as it is. And the goal is to add a digital fence here so that you can compartmentalize your monolith and extend it without having to rewrite it. So let's take a look at a specific breakdown here. We already mapped our contexts. So now I've just walked through the functionality I would expect in my app for authentication. And here I've got 8 things that can be done. These are my 8 APIs. Now what's interesting is authentication might be a total hot mess. It might be an unmitigated train wreck in our application, but the only thing we really care about is these 8 little points here, these 8 adapters, if you will. And if we create these and we offer them to other folks, they can be insulated from all the complexity that really goes into authentication. And that really, this pattern is what's going to help you. So you want to think of this as a progression. There's probably some really low-hanging fruit in your monolith that you can start to pull out. Sometimes this is a context that doesn't relate a lot to other contexts. It doesn't have to be an amazing thing that you pull out. It just has to be something. And so what you want to do is pull out a chunk of functionality and put it in APIs. The next step looks a lot like this step, but you've accomplished more stuff. And now you have APIs that are wired into applications that do the same thing as they did in the monolith, but they're not conflated with all this other stuff. And this means if one needs to scale, you can scale the API or the context instead of having to try to scale the entire monolith. The sort of culmination in this, and this is not the pure academic model, but it's the real life model, is you're going to end up with parts of this that just can't be refactored because they're either messy or it's not worth it. I call this the junk drawer. And it's fine to have a junk drawer as long as you fence it off and you can still close the drawer. So if you're done with this project and there's still a chunk of your app that's conflated, it's not really hurting anybody, cool. You're not trying to win any prizes here for, you know, following the one true architecture. You're really just trying to modernize and do it efficiently. So all the stuff that's shared, or shareable or disentangleable ends up as APIs, and all the stuff that's not stays where it is, and everything's fenced off and happy. When you pitch this project to your boss for funding, likely what will happen is they'll say, yes, this is great, but we have a whole lot of features we want to add too. Don't add them in at this point. That is a bad idea. The reason why is because you want to be able to validate that when you made all these changes and pulled this context stuff into APIs and plugged it back into your app, that your app still works. And if you went and changed a bunch of stuff, now your testing isn't deterministic. It's probably going to be off. And that's really where a lot of these projects fall into trouble, is to try to do too much. Writing wrappers around monoliths is pretty straightforward. Adding functionality while writing wrappers around monoliths, total problem. So try and avoid it if possible. So let's walk through how this looks. So this is your application now, let's say. You have your app in the middle. It's this e-commerce-y thing, and it's basically a monolithic app. And the application is basically referencing directly this monolithic application. This is every app ever that's not built with APIs. What you want to do here, step one, is inject this API manager right in the middle. Think of it like a wall. And your app will talk to the API manager exclusively. It's very monogamous. The API manager talks to your monolithic app. At this point, you haven't really changed anything, just things that are pointing to things, and maybe written a couple of wrappers, but there's no functionality, there's no containerization. It's basically just disconnecting your app from the monolith and plugging them both into the API manager. At this point, you can start to break things up, and maybe what you end up with pragmatically is 2 monoliths and an API container, or maybe it's 15 serverless APIs. Like, you've got to decide when enough is enough. But once you've kind of delinked your app from the monolith, you have all kinds of freedom now, because I'm free to change whatever I want to the left of the API manager, and my apps don't have to know, which means my users don't have to know, and I don't have to change application source code. I can just do whatever I want. A common example of this is, let's say your company merged with another company and you've got 2 order systems. Rather than have people use 2 order systems, you can facade it with the API manager and then refactor them together so that they've been merged without having to inconvenience your users or the infrastructure people or anyone who's related to that. So just because I needed another slide with spaghetti, here's how it looks if you're trying to protect your spaghetti. So you see how I've got these entry points here? I've got 6 of them. Those are going to be my APIs. And it's fine if what's inside is messy, because nobody can get to it except through the ways that I let them. And you want to think about these APIs as like plugs or adapters or seams or something. In fact, a really good way to look at it is think of them like an Ethernet cable. You have 8 pieces of wire here and a plastic clip. And that can carry everything from the latest video from TikTok or work email. It doesn't matter. The complexity is off to the side. But these plug parts, they're well designed and they're simplified. And that's how your API should be. As an example, this is a great API because there's one way in and one way out. So the complexity or the chaos is protected. As a bonus feature, you can desync your development, which is kind of interesting, because sometimes when you're working in an environment that you have front-end coders and back-end coders, they sort of step on each other, and timelines get missed and sprint plans go awry. So think about it this way. Let's say you have a front-end team and they're working on a feature, and now they need some stuff from the back-end team, so they're blocked. And the back-end team's doing something else, and they're going to get around to this, and when they do, the front-end team can kind of pick the feature back up and then finish it. This happens in almost every team ever, and it's almost considered the cost of doing business. But what if you could stick APIs, like mock APIs, in the API manager and use those on the front side of your application? And as the back-end team handles their business, they can plug their API into the API manager and no front-end code has to change. And now the front-end team can go feature 1, feature 2, feature 3, whatever works for them, and the backend team can do their thing, and people aren't stepping on each other because of the lack of tight coupling. So in short, smaller things, they're easier to understand, they're much easier to scale, they're way easier to version, you can share them better, and also they're easy to retire. Like, we should celebrate retiring code, because a lot of times coding is like wiping duct tape on the floor. Like, it just accumulates more and more things, kind of like this dude's jacket with the cat hair. But, you know, if you can retire code, then there's less failure points, there's less things less opportunity for things to get out of sync, and there's less need to manage it. So, you know, I think we don't talk about this enough. Getting rid of stuff is important, spring cleaning and all that. So now you're asking yourself, hey, great, now I understand the strategy to use. Well, how do I get there? And you're going to be surprised about this, but the answer is the ColdFusion API Manager. So like I said, when I first picked up this product, I didn't know what to expect. It's an enterprise only feature, which is used to be kind of a turnoff for me, but at my last job, we actually sold a product that had a lot of these features, and the price tag was like 60, 120. We sold some for $500,000. Like, it's up there. It's nowhere near as cheap as this product is. This product is bundled with ColdFusion Enterprise, and so you sort of, quote, get it for free, unquote. By putting this in here, I'm going to walk you through why you won't care about the price, because if this is the product for you, it'll pay for itself in the first couple of months. So let's go over a couple of facts. I installed this with Docker, which means it's no install. You can sort of run a command and turn the container on or turn it off. So that deployment option is available. You can also install it like a standalone product. It is not bundled in ColdFusion. So it doesn't run inside of a ColdFusion server. It doesn't require ColdFusion. In fact, the APIs it manages doesn't have to be in ColdFusion. It can be in any language or a mix of languages, as long as it's either SOAP or REST. One neat feature is it can auto-create APIs from a variety of sources. And I will go a little bit more in depth into this, but I was pretty impressed that I could take Swagger, which is like a kind of a common API documentation structure, and just drop it here in this API manager. And all of a sudden I had 15, 20 correct APIs, all spelled correctly, implemented correctly for basically no pain. This API manager is highly, highly scalable. A lot of thought was put into how to build this product so it would scale well. I've got a screenshot later to show you some example usage, but you know, you aren't going to burn out the API manager. It's not what's going to be consuming your bottlenecks. Also, it can also convert SOAP to REST. A lot of people tell me that they made big investments in SOAP back in the day, and they're being asked for REST now, but can't justify rewriting their APIs. Well, what if a robot could do it? And if your company is in that spot now where your business partners or customers want REST and you can't get to it because you have a lot of SOAP, you can push a button and it magically happens. And when it magically happens, it's all perfect code. Also, you can choose between XML or JSON responses. And then there's a pretty decent analytics source built in here too. What's nice about that is you don't have to implement analytics in your APIs. It does it for you. And so you can get a good idea of the health and performance of your API portfolio from a single spot without having to implement analytics things inside all your APIs. So let's actually look at some parts of the product. This is the resource page here. You can see this is the Swagger pet store. This is a common example in Swagger that kind of models a pet store. And I took the Swagger configuration document and put it in here and got all these APIs basically for free. And what's nice about this is your documentation for the API, what it consumes, what it produces, the parameters it accepts, and the documentation is always up to date because it's based on the actual code. And so if you think about the pain and agony of documenting stuff, it's sort of done here for you for free. And who doesn't like free documentation that doesn't go out of sync? Here are the 5 ways you can create APIs with the API Manager. The first one, create a REST API, kind of walks you through a web interface. The next one, you can basically point it at a ColdFusion API, and it'll pull the information from there and create an API in the API Manager for you. A third way is to import Swagger like I did, and that was awesome, by the way. Swagger is kind of an industry standard, so this isn't some weird product no one's ever heard of. It's kind of a big deal. You can create REST APIs from SOAP. Once again, hugely awesome because the APIs are based off of the SOAP and the machine does it, so the code's great. And then also you can import a SOAP API directly if you want to maintain your SOAP APIs for whatever reason. And obviously all these things can be versioned inside the product, and so you can preserve people using your APIs while still moving APIs forward. Now, this is a cool feature. If you imagine the life cycle of an API request, somebody makes a request, and then the server gives a response. With the API Manager, you can run what they call policies, and think of these like hooks, like some kind of processing hooks that you can either run on the request or on the response. And so an example of using a hook on the request might be to examine the request and make sure it's not malicious. Well, that's something you can stick in here and configure it for APIs, and you don't have to manually code them. You almost have like this, almost like a gateway where you check the ID of the requester through this policy, if you like, and make sure it's legit. You can also do data transforms. And so on your response, maybe you want to tweak it. Feel free to do that. There's an easy mechanism here to do things on the request and on the response in a very straightforward way, and also be able to audit what's being done. You get a free load balancer if you like it. The screen here is showing you the weighted round robin version because I think that's the most complex version here. You could just have no load balancing, or you could just do straight up round robin. But with the weighting, say you have a server that's just more capable, you assign it the appropriate amount of weight and it gets that kind of traffic. And so that's built into the product. You can also not do this if you have your own load balancer, but I thought this was kind of cool and very thoughtful. And here's how you'd administer your policies. So once you create them, you stick them in here however you want them to be ordered, and that's how they'll be processed. So you would read it from left to right. And so if there's a transform, it happens at the transform step. If there's a possibility to eject a request from the result of a policy, it would eject at that point. It's very straightforward and also lightweight. So this isn't going to drag down your request or your response time at all. There's a way here where you can centralize the storage of your key stores. You can import one, which is what I have here. You can also create one from scratch, which is a similar screen with different words on it. But just know you can kind of consolidate all that so you don't have to worry about it. This is actually cool. So for your security here, you can plug directly into a database, and maybe that's where your auth lives. Or you can plug up to your LDAP if you want. Or you can do anything you want. Just write a piece of JavaScript that does it. And so here, I'm showing connecting to a remote API and pulling some data. But basically, the world's your oyster here. If you have an interesting way to do security or don't want to expose your database connection pool outside of this gateway, you can handle it right here. And this isn't a feature that's offered in too many of these products, even ones that cost like 5 to 20 times more. And then, of course, you can do throttling and rate limits and things like that. Sometimes this is good for just making sure people don't beat you up too bad. You can create as many plans as you like with any of these configuration options as you like, and apply them to certain resources or users or whatever makes sense for you. Here's a snapshot of some of the analytics. Like I said, these come along for free. I'll point out this is coming out of a real company's API Manager instance, of which they have 2, by the way. This is a week's worth of traffic, 172 million processed requests. That's pretty impressive. You can see the requests per hour on the right, how it kind of bounces up and down between, 3 to 5 million. That's, this is a no joke instance. And the response time here is about 88 milliseconds. So I think if there's been any questions or concerns around can this thing scale, this is the money slide because I doubt anyone else I know has this kind of traffic. This is no joke traffic. Now, all that is great and lovely, and it's great to have GUIs, but what if you could administer all this stuff with APIs? Well, obviously, if you couldn't, I wouldn't have this slide. So you can. Now, why do you want to do this? Well, imagine you had a bunch of API customers. Do you really want to be going in there and assigning custom SLAs to all of them? Or would you rather create them through this magic API process? If you said the latter, then boy is the ColdFusion API Manager for you. So I think, not only is there a lot of amazing functionality here in how you can create and administer APIs, and also, delink them from applications so you have more architectural freedom, but you can also easily add this to whatever other things you have to control it. So if you have a server or some application that provisions users, plug it up to the SLA thing. Why not? You don't have to do any extra work. It just magically happens for you. So, hopefully this is a quick tour of the product. I think probably what people want to see more than slide share is just me kind of doing a quick demo. So let's do that. All right, so here's the sort of home page of the product, if you will. This Swagger pet store, I went ahead and added in, like I say, by importing Swagger. You can do it through the variety of methods here. But this one right here was done through Swagger. So let's look at it. We're going to go to the resources section, which shows you what you can do. And now let's look at the documentation for pet find by status. So I click on this and you can see, it doesn't consume anything. It produces either JSON or XML. Here's the parameters it accepts. It doesn't have any authentication. I have these things turned off because this is a demo app, but if they're important for you, go ahead and turn them on. And now let's actually use this. So I'm just going to move over here to test this API. And we're going to put in a status of, let's say, available. And we want to see this in JSON. And I'll run the API here. Let's see if we have any available pets. So this is the request it made for me. You can see it's a GET request. And it has one parameter here of the available status. And if I look at the response, it's a 200, so that's great. And right here I see there's a pet with an ID of 691. And here's one with 694. Let's pick, for simplicity, we'll go up to 691. So now I'm going to change this. Now, if you look, the name of this dog is Doggy. So it's really highly technical. Let's change it to something else. So I'm going to go to the post method. Posts are used for changing stuff. And then I'm going to enter the pet ID of 691 like we said. Hi, CF Meetup. And we'll make the status available as well. And we're going to produce here some more JSON. Bang. Now let's see if I can pull 691 and it actually did something. Let's see. So I'm on the GET request for pet/pet ID. I'm going to enter 691. Bang. Going to produce JSON because why not? And the request here that went across, it's all good. Response body is pet not found. Why is that? So there is no pet 691. It's not passing my little parameter here. I find that strange. Let's try pet by find status.
Hey, Dan.
Yo.
Nicole has said in the chat, you got an error on the previous post. I wasn't watching, so I didn't see it, but she says you got an error on the previous post. Don't know if that's a clue for you.
404. Let's pick a new pet. What I may have done is just read this too fast. So the ID is 703. So let's use 703. And by the way, we're testing an API that we don't own right now. So 703.
And Adam chimed in saying 691 might have been a tag ID or something.
Okay, so this gave us a 200, so that's good. And then, so the name here is Indrik. And so now we're going to go back to this post thing and hit 703. I feel like this is going to work, people. Let's see. Boom. 200, unknown. Okay, so that's great. Now let's go pull our pet again by the ID of 703. Look at there. It does take a village. So what did we just see? And I know I kind of blazed through this quickly, but I thought this would be an important topic that we'd want to have more time for Q&A. If it turns out the API strategy that I listed in the first half of this is important for you, the video is going to be available. I'll give you the slide deck, watch it at half speed, and I'll sound almost normal. But the other thing we got here is we imported this Swagger and got all of these API definitions. And then we used the tool to kind of walk through and test and make sure that one thing does what it's supposed to do and another thing does what it's supposed to do. And to be fair, folks, I haven't written a single line of code, period. Not to create the APIs, not to create test harnesses. I didn't do any authentication. All this is the magic of the API manager. And so the beautiful thing of all this is when you implement the API manager, your APIs are registered in one place. Your key stores are in one place. You can process things and get the actual results. You can plug into your own custom authentication in one place. Your APIs are documented in one place. There's no questions this thing is scalable. And for a product like this, how much would you pay? 50 grand, 100 grand? Like I say, we had people paying in the $500,000. This thing is a CF Enterprise license. That's it. It's really the most hidden gem of all of ColdFusion. It gives you so much ability to modernize your applications and takes the heavy lifting off for you. So let me hold here, take some questions. Is it possible for us to get the Swagger Pet Stores APIs to have examples on our own manager? Absolutely. So I don't know if the actual APIs you can have, but you can have the definitions. So let me go up and look here at the comments and see where we're at. You did offer the recording. That's great. What's the best way? I don't think there's any
outstanding questions, but you can go ahead and look them over.
Yep. So what's the best way to mock an API to use in the API manager? Are there tools for that? How do you mock the desired response data in the API manager?
Hey, Dan, before you answer that question, is that a private chat to you? Because we don't see that in the chat.
Yeah, they're sending them private. It's probably just simpler.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
So the question is, how do you mock up an API to use? So if you're a ColdFusion developer, you'd probably build a ColdFusion API and then register that with the API manager. So one thing I may not have done a good job disambiguating here is the API manager doesn't actually create the APIs. It doesn't know about your databases. It doesn't know your architectural standards. And so what it is a registration point for APIs. And so if I go back to my diagram here, yeah, this sort of tells it best. And so the parts I'm responsible for are to the left of that sort of orange box that I've designated as the API manager. So I'll have to build an inventory API. And so what this means is somewhere in my monolithic application, I've got some query somewhere that says select star from inventory where star equals star. And then there's some logic that happens to sort of, maybe it like processes that query somehow. Maybe it just keeps throwing it upwards until it gets to the view layer. Your responsibility is to find that point where the inventory data is correct and then plant a flag there. And then you would take your ColdFusion code and wrap it around there into an API, and that would be inventory.load inventory. And then you would plug that into your monolithic application. So it's no longer straight up calling a local CFC or even a custom tag or whatever, but it's calling this API. And it can call it locally. But the point is that you've encapsulated what load inventory is, and then you're referring to that in your application. In the front side of your application, you'll connect into this API manager and say, I'd like the inventory, please. And in there, you can kind of link what that actually does. So let me try to pull up the demonstration piece again. So see this URL here? Let me make this bigger. This URL is a local URL to the API manager that operates on version 1.0.5 of this pet resource. And I have the pet ID, that's the signature. But the actual API, like if I was to go to the endpoints here, yeah, so right here, this is the actual destination. And so my local application is going to call localhost, which is the API manager. And the API manager in turn is going to go outside to petstore.swagger.io/version2 and then pass that pet/whatever pet ID I put in there. So it's almost like a proxy, if you will, or a redirector, if you will. But because of that redirection piece, the benefit that you get is your application doesn't know that this is this application and this server. And so if you want to move this around later, you can. Or if you want to share inventory with 5 other apps, you can. You see what I mean? Like by disconnecting the source of data or processes from the user interface, you gain a lot more control. And some of that control is in what user interfaces you can allow. Like, why couldn't we offer an Alexa now that we have our inventory? Alexa, cancel. Now that we have our inventory broken up in an API format. Why not? I mean, it's just a voice API, isn't it? A voice user interface. Same thing with customers. Maybe that needs to be made available somewhere else. And so you have the ability to meet future technology needs while also redistributing how you sort of process and stage your servers and how you allocate resources for computing and things like that, because you're dealing with smaller, more isolated things. Just catching up with the questions here. That's Charlie. And then Jeffrey said, can you make a demo making a normal select star from user CFC into the API manager? I could, but I don't have a database on this machine. This is my work machine, and it's not set up for ColdFusion. But I mean, it could really just be as simple as a remote CFC with a query in there that just returns it. Or you walk over to make JSON out of the query. Like, it's not going to be difficult. In fact, one thing I meant to say at the beginning of this talk, but didn't do so, is because APIs and REST was so high on people's list, we've planned a series of content around this. And so you came to this talk, and hopefully what you got out of it is, first, how do I get my apps into an API state? What are some options? And second, is the API manager something I should look at? And that's up to you. But following this, Gavin Picken is going to do an API talk that's a little more nuts and bolty. And also Brian Sappi may also do an API talk. And we're also blessed with the magnificent presence of Adam Tuttle, who wrote a book on REST. And I'm sure if we cajoled him and asked him nicely enough, he would be willing to come and also talk about this stuff. So, you know, I'm glad there's an appetite for it. Sorry, Jeffrey, I can't do that at this point in time. Plus, I'm a terrible typist. You wouldn't want to see me write that CFC anyway, but I guarantee you we'll have content coming up in the next few weeks that address those questions. And Adam, what was the title of your book again? Would you please add a link into the chat for those who don't have it handy? So there it is in the chat, called Rest Assured. The I have a lot of respect for Adam. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm sure it's amazing. And this book will probably help you. Like I say, ideally, we have him on the spot now and can get him to do a talk soon and talk about some of the concerns that people would like more information on. So we have another question. Can this be used as a process to put a new UI into an older CF application, as opposed to making a number of changes to make it browser compatible? So Larry, that's actually a pretty interesting point here. So in my mind, this process could absolutely do that, because that the work of separating the user interface from the business logic and data is really where is the work I'm basically asking you guys to address here. You need to take that on. Once that's done, you absolutely can implement this in more modern technology. And that might be the right thing to do, because, if you leave the business logic and data alone, the user interface parts are much easier to understand and test. In fact, I would say that it's a lot more risky messing around trying to untangle a monolith with missing some important business logic than it is of missing some important user interface thing. Like, the risks are just different. And so we've certainly seen people take a monolith, break it up into APIs, and then offer more modern user interfaces or different classes of interfaces, because they now can share the data and logic, which simplifies the app development and construction.
Hey, Dan, can I chime in for a second?
Sure.
So I've talked to people for a few years now about the API Manager. For those who don't know, it came out with CF 2016. And just looking at the last couple of questions, this may not be what Larry was getting at. And hello, Larry. Haven't talked to you in a while. But just to be clear, this couldn't be used to do that conversion or to avoid you doing that conversion. He says, could it be used as a process to put a new UI on? Well, it could be used as part of the process, but like Dan just said, it would be on you to modify your app to make it API enabled. I just want to clarify that, because sometimes when people first hear about this API Manager and they see the demos that Adobe does or that others do, there's a lot of overwhelming info. It's all new. It's just a way to manage APIs, either that you have created or that others have created. And it's a way to do a lot of stuff with them, to make them easy to look at, to explore. Dan later, I'm sure, cover, you can throttle them, you can secure them, you can manage versioning of them. That's where the power of the API Manager is. But it doesn't do any work to enable anything that you would ever use for your end users, in the sense of the tool making something different for your users. Not at all. It's a proxy, as it were, to manage the communication of APIs, not something that would build code for you. And Dan made that point. I just wanted to reiterate it to make sure it's clear.
Yep. I think, if you're starting a process like this, and I have a feeling many people would like to, and you're thinking to yourself, how do I break up the work? Like, the approaches I've put in here from a strategy perspective are pretty sound approaches. It's just enough architecture without going crazy. I'm not pitching the one true way. I've given you plenty of room to say, well, this doesn't fit, because in the real world, there's things that just don't. But, if you embark upon an APIization of your application, eventually you're going to ask yourself, well, we need to be monitoring the requests and making sure everything's healthy. And we need to find a way to store these key stores, because they're all over the place. And we need to find a way to keep our documentation in sync. And we need to find a way to cache or do any of the other capabilities that are found in the API Manager. And so, just because you choose not to use this product doesn't mean that you can avoid doing the things that it has to do, because eventually it's going to come up. And so you might as well start from a position of sort of known good here and begin with quality monitoring and the ability to run these policies and tie into your authentication things, because it's just going to save you time. You're removing complexity. You're avoiding building things from scratch that really, someone else put a lot of thought into how to build a professional quality API Manager. And while it sounds like fun to build one on your own, the first 80% would be fun and the next 80% would not be fun. So, from a strategic perspective, offloading that to the API manager makes a lot of sense to me because you get a fully featured tool that handles all this stuff without having to build it from scratch. So the question is, will it retry calls that fail? Will it log calls that are made? The logging stuff happens in analytics. The retrying calls that fail, I don't think it does that. If I'm wrong, hopefully Brian will chime in here because he's a super power user of this, and if he doesn't know, nobody knows. But my thinking is that it won't do that. That's part of your application logic. When you say server fails, do you mean like the API server or the server with the API that you're calling? Okay, so if at 500s, you can have a failover URL or structure. Nice. So if at 500s, you can have a failover request or an API for that. So that's good to know. That's an important thing to have. Yeah, curious what that costs. I'm sure it's a non-zero number. We got about 5 minutes. So any other questions here while the gang's all assembled? We have Adam Tuttle, the REST expert. We have Brian, the API manager expert, and me kind of refereeing. So this is a great time to ask the questions on your mind. All right, Charlie, it seemed to have slowed down. If people want to stick around after this, I'm more than happy to take off the record questions.
Did you see that next couple questions that came up?
Good tutorials on how to set up and use the API manager. That's a good question. So the documentation is actually, I have a love-hate with it right now. Let me show you the parts I love first. It's always better to start there. So imagine that, I don't know, let's say I'm on SLA plans and I want to know what can be done here. There's a help button right here that will take you right to the parts you care about. And so now I can read anything I want to know about this feature, and the documentation here is pretty good. There is kind of a getting started experience with the API manager that asked me to use some demographics API, and I didn't get that working for some reason and didn't really want to invest too much time in it. In fact, once I found the Swagger thing, I kind of like that a lot. But let's see if we can go through the process to create an API. So let's see. When I create an API, create a REST API. API name is going to be Brandon said so. We need an endpoint here. Let's grab one from our, whatever that was. I'm making all this up as I go, so hopefully it works the way you want. If I go to endpoints, where's that silly thing at? There it is. We'll paste that in here. Visibility, all that's happy and fine. Save. Resource. Edit. Let's do an easy one. Pet get find by status. All right, with any luck, this will work. Oh, I didn't tell it what it takes. We need to put a parameter here. Somewhere you can put in a parameter. There it is. Status, and it is a query. All right, that I like. All right, so if I save this and then test it, it should possibly work. Hey, look at there. So the steps were basically you create an endpoint, then you create a resource, you configure the verbs, you put in what parameters they take, and then test it. Did you copy that, Brandon? You want me to do it again now that I kind of can do this live and with people staring at me? Brandon, do you want more?
We've got a couple minutes. You can go for it.
Let's pick another one. All right, so this is going to be pet ID. Being attacked by the screen share stuff. Let me move that out of the way.
Hey, while you're doing that, let me just address some people can watch what you're doing and you can speak about whatever you need to jump in. But some people have asked questions and since some folks are leaving. Jim, for instance, asked, is it available as a standalone product? And I clarified it's a standalone product, but the license to use it in production only comes with CF Enterprise, which is indeed a curious approach, but that's what they decided to do.
All right. Save that. And let's see if pet ID works. 703. Done. Pet not found. At least we got an error. Let's get a real ID. $7.96. 796. Like people are using these APIs right now to do their things, and they could be deleting them right out from underneath this. So if I type in 796, it works. Yeah. So I've just kind of entered in. Oh, look, someone's. I know what you're trying to do. That's not going to work.
Wow.
But that's how the internet sort of goes, isn't it? So basically, all you're doing is registering endpoints and then also resources. And a resource is basically a combination of what HTTP verbs you can do and what the signature is, and then any parameters. We've just added 2 of them in 5 minutes.
Hey, while we wait for any other follow-up questions, I want to say one more on the recording because some people just don't read the chat. Somebody asked earlier about the documentation, and you shared what you could in the interface itself. And I'd pointed out that if you just Google the term ColdFusion API Manager, the first six results that come up are entry points into lots of documentation on the API Manager. Just like with CF, there's a lot more manuals covering different aspects than some people realize. And then there were also articles and blog posts by Adobe and other people, especially back when it came out in 2016. And while the tool has had some changes in 2018, most such older resources would still be useful for working with the tool.
So we have another question from Brandon here about doing a ColdFusion one. I don't have any, like I said, I don't have anything installed here, but let's just see what the screen would look like for create API and a CFC. Yeah, so I'd have to register a ColdFusion server, and I imagine it does some sort of talking to the server to see what APIs are registered. I don't actually know how that works. I haven't tried it yet, but if someone has tried it.
I can jump in. Yeah, so there's a couple things to clarify because some people are asking about CFCs, and you mentioned correctly earlier that one could just set up a remote CFC that responds to requests, and so certainly people can do that. And there's just a URL, and you can pass in the CFC name, question mark, method equals, and name a method, and ampersand, pass in arguments. You can do that. But yes, if you use ColdFusion and its REST feature, then if you register a REST service in the CF administrator, then this feature of the admin API can look at the setting up of that REST service in the in the REST interface of CF and effectively pull it in. It exposes Swagger and it pulls it in, but it's just a more direct way to say, hey, I've got something in ColdFusion, can you go get it? But you could also, you don't have to use this. You could just point to the URL with whatever REST endpoints you create, or again, you could even call it more directly without even being, well, I guess it has to be REST. This tool seems to only talk to REST and SOAP, so it probably has to be REST.
SOAP, yeah.
And it can be Taffy too. And so this is just a shortcut if you use the ColdFusion feature to create REST services and register them in the admin. This is a shortcut to pull in their definition.
So it knows how to read that data and pull everything in. Yeah, that's cool.
Swagger, so.
I've never actually used that feature in ColdFusion myself. I've always just built APIs from scratch.
Sure. As one can, or use Taffy.
Yep, that's a great way to put it, Adam. It's a job to stand in the middle and broker the requests and responses between consumers and the producers.
Yep. It is truly an API manager. That somehow that seems to be missed by people sometimes, or they see the demos and think it's more. It's a, like I said, a broker, it's a proxy. It can do all kinds of, and you didn't even cover everything. You know, there's securing them, throttling them, managing versions of them. It's really powerful. So go check out the docs. There's a lot more than even Dan's shown here. And
yeah, and hey folks, I can't even talk faster than this. And so this is as much as we could do. But if people want more topics on the API manager, we'll do them. Just let us know.
Sure. Look on the left, you can see SLAs, you can do that. Caching, you can do that. So it's really very powerful, very powerful. And like Dan said, there's other ones like it that are a boatload more money. So if you've got ColdFusion Enterprise, you know, it's the license gets you this, you can use it. And even, again, repeat the point, you don't have to pay for it. If you just want to play with it, just like with ColdFusion, there's a free developer edition. Just go get it. I shared a link earlier to the, in the chat, I shared a link to get it. If you just go to the ColdFusion downloads, just Google that, ColdFusion downloads, that page that comes up, one of the links is the API manager for 2018 or 2016.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to hit me up privately, like I got my information here. I should have done this before, but I'd rather be doing what you guys want to do. Let's see. You can find me on Twitter and my emails, and like I'm happy to have a chat with you and tell you what I know and help. There you go.
While he's getting there, by the way, Brandon, we do this weekly. This has been a weekly meetup for a couple of months, and this is the 269th. So yeah, we do them regularly. Now, whether we would do this always on the API manager, you said let's make the Adobe API manager famous. You know, that if you're thinking maybe there could be a ColdFusion API manager meetup, that would be different, but we'll see.
Yeah, if anybody has to go, just go. Like, we appreciate you coming. I know that you probably have 1 o'clock or 12 o'clock meetings or whatever it is. Just drop. And, you know, I appreciate all your time, and you guys coming makes us all worthwhile, ladies as well. So appreciate it. I really do.
Yes, sir. And Jim just shared the link again to that downloads page I was referring to. And let me just remind people that if you're interested in the Docker image, earlier in the chat, I shared also the link to that Docker image. From there, you can see how to use it, how to pull it, where it is. All that is in the URL that I shared earlier in the chat. So go back and check that out. And there's a question from Larry coming in.
Yeah, while he's typing that, Charlie, I was sitting there waiting to see if there was any questions, and it turned out I had the chat scroll up about halfway, and I missed probably a page of
yeah, it's annoying the way that works in Zoom. And then it does have a little new messages thing to bring you down to it. It's got some annoyances, but we'll figure it out.
It seemed to work well, though, Zoom.
Yep.
I assume, Larry, you're still typing your question?
Yeah, and that's one thing connected that was nice. You could see when people were typing, so you knew it was coming. For security, I guess Zoom presumes not to do that, and it might be a long question. But I'm glad you got to share that information there, and I'll say again right now, thank you for doing the talk. In case people have to drop off, they've expressed lots of appreciation. Thank you. Okay.
Hey, thanks, Adam. It's good to see you, man.
Awesome.
I appreciate you cutting on your video for 2 minutes. I really liked that. So if there's something Charlie or I can do to help you find a time or pick a topic,
Absolutely.
you know, let us know. I appreciate you coming. Thank you, Robin.
And did you see Larry did type?
I was thinking I would change the underlying CFCs and have API Manager as how the UI would talk to the application. So you change the CFCs and point them to the API Manager. You take the new application and point it to the API Manager. Is that what you're talking about?
Doesn't quite sound right.
Yeah, so that's exactly the strategy that I'd recommend. And I would start with, well, look, a lot depends on stuff we don't have the time to get into because it's going to be individual. But the most risk-free and in my mind, the most straightforward way to do this is take your existing app and change nothing except for all the calls that need to be APIs, make them APIs, and then test your app. If it works like it used to, you're doing great. Then you can plug other apps into it, and you know that you can trust the APIs, they work. You're not dealing with one system that's cowboy coded and another system that's trying to use APIs. Like everybody's eating from the same trough, so to speak. So you won't have that classic problem of an error on this set of the code, but not in the other set of the code, and it's, quote, supposed to work the same, unquote. That's why step one in my refactor was, you know, build up some APIs and plug them into your existing app. They're wrappers, so it's easy-ish. You got to be thoughtful about this, but you know, the job has a start and an end date. You know what I mean? It's a constrained amount of work. Then after you have those, absolutely build the new user interfaces, and you can trust that the APIs are right. So it's a two-phase deal. All righty, Jim, we've got you up next. I'll come up with a topic and assign a date for you and not tell you until the night before. See you, buddy.
So I just want to add a clarification back when Larry said, and have the API manager as how the UI would talk to the application. And you said, yes, that's the way you do it. So you guys, you at least, are meaning the client would send its request for URLs to the API manager, and it would pass them on to ColdFusion. That is true. But I just want to keep repeating, I don't want anybody to think that the UI would be the API manager. Definitely not. So maybe you both get that.
There used to be this thing, what was that appliance called?
Thanks, Larry.
You could basically use like a message queue inside of an application, inside of an enterprise application architecture, where everything would point to the message queue, and the message queue would sort of link thing one to thing two.
Sure. That
way apps weren't tightly coupled to it.
Yep.
I kind of look at this as that same way. Instead of being like a service broker on the back end for things like that, it's really like an API broker managing who's connected to what.
Sure.
And once you disconnect your business logic and data from your user interface, a whole lot of options become available to you. And this is way more achievable than a rewrite of your application.
And adding those things like throttling and SLAs and security that can all be managed by the API manager. So yes, definitely. Sure.
Yeah, and even if you think you don't need throttling, like imagine you've got, I don't know, an internal business partner that forgets how to close a while loop and they end up endless looping and bashing your servers to death. Like you can prevent that so easily by just even adding a somewhat ludicrous SLA to everybody. That way,
There you go.
if there is something that's haywire, you don't pay the penalty for that. See what I mean?
Sure.
Brendan, what do you mean by management?
Yeah, I was going to ask the same question.
We could go on about this. What do you mean? Remember, we're here to serve. So if there's something we can add and present on, we'll do it somehow.
And he might mean management of APIs, or he might mean management of software development. And there'll be a limit to some topics that might be a little too far afield. Although, one on something far afield is not terrible. To explain the admin portal, there you go, the manager portal, where the APIs live, resources and points and URLs. Yep. And let me just throw out there that there are such recordings, folks. If you guys just go to YouTube, Adobe has been giving talks on this API manager for 4 years. And there are YouTube videos where both developers and engineers and users give such walkthroughs of the very many features. So I don't say that to say we're not going to do it, but I just want to clarify. Somebody said it could be, we could do an online CF API Manager meetup and probably never run out of topics. But we don't want this ColdFusion meetup to be that. Whether we maybe interject one a month or two a month, we'll see. But I'm just saying you can find lots of resources out there.
Hey, Brandon, do me a favor. I don't know if you have Twitter or not, but you can see on the screen route is my Twitter and my LinkedIn. Get a hold of me and let's talk about like an outline of what you're looking for, and I'm sure we can get it done. Okay, cool. I will agree to that request as soon as I see it, and then I really want your input because I don't know why this isn't a super major popular feature of ColdFusion. It's bizarre to me that something this valuable is in the product and nobody really knows about it. So,
and let me just throw in, Brandon and anybody else that wonders, if you just go to YouTube and you put in ColdFusion API Manager, there are dozens of recordings, dozens of them. And you'll see that many of them are from Adobe ColdFusion. So they're not just generic ones, even though the title may look generic. They are from ColdFusion. They are about the API Manager. And then they even have a 9-part playlist. So again, I'm not discouraging us from doing more, but I want anybody who's interested in this to know, hey, you don't have to wait for us. There's lots out there. And if you felt like you couldn't find it, just try ColdFusion API Manager. And I didn't even put it in quotes, just that alone in YouTube. Found a whole bunch of stuff. But awesome for you to offer for, to guide him more directly, Dan. Thank you for that.
Sweet.
Larry. All right. Well, very good. Thanks, sir. And it sounds like we got lots more topics. If you wanted to do more on this, or others want to, absolutely, we can have others. And let's be clear, anybody's welcome to talk. So if anybody has tried the API Manager and wants to share their experience, that's cool. If there's a particular feature you want to talk about that's cool. Just let us know on the coldfusionmeetup.com site. You can find out how to easily talk to us. The mic is disabled by the host. I'm not sure why you're saying that. Yeah, we don't open up the mic for everybody to talk. That would be a little too
that would be
much.
back to that slide with the wildebeest running for sure. By the way, I can check that off my list. I finally got a herd of wildebeests in on a presentation. All righty, Mark. Have a good one.
Yeah, and that's a good time to go ahead and stop the recording at 40, hour and 15 minutes. So thanks everybody for coming along. Thanks again, Dan.
Thank you, Charlie.
And we will have news about interesting new talk to come in a couple of weeks. We'll get that out maybe this week or next week. And we may have a talk next week. And we'll get that out this week if we do. All righty. Till the next time, everybody. And
have
again,
a good day.
Again. bet. See you, sir.